This is the Mass Effect HYPEcast, episode 13. I'm your host, Morgan, aka Bond Diesel, and this is a podcast about Mass Effect, the future of BioWare's premier franchise, and all of our speculation and ideas for their next game. Be sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app, leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, and subscribe to the Bond Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast. Normally I would break right here, but this is where I will reiterate. Please give me a rating on Spotify and iTunes. Those ratings help show their algorithm or whatever that more people want to see this. And especially with this podcast still being fairly small and with few episodes, especially on iTunes, but Spotify as well. Those 5-star reviews or whatever you want to give it really do help out. So please do that now. Thank you. Let's get into the Mass Effect topics for this episode. As a quick preface, I've been sick all weekend. I'm actually feeling a lot better now, but you still may be able to tell if there's any weird edits. It's because I'm editing out me coughing or sneezing or whatever. So please be patient with me. I do apologize for that, and we'll get on to business. Okay, first, I think the most obvious topic to go into is BioWare's blog for the N7 Day 2025. This one was written by Mike Gamble, who's the project director on the next Mass Effect game. I will say, every time a blog is written by Gamble, it's a good thing. Every time it's written by Gary McKay, who's the CEO of BioWare, it often is at least neutral things, if not bad. So obviously, this being written by Mike is expected, especially for N7 Day, and it wasn't the big blowout I think that many of us were hoping for or wanted. I know I had been predicting that this would be kind of their chance to be like, look at everything we have. EA, please don't shut us down. But if you do, someone else please buy us. And here's what we're doing. And that wasn't what this is. So, going straight up off of that, if you want to be the most speculative, if you want to be the most, looking into this as deeply as you can, them not seeming desperate, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe there's been the articles and the stories and all that written about BioWare and how, everything is humdrum and stressful there. I suspect that's actually true, but at least from the leadership, the people who decide what would go into a blog like this, it doesn't seem like they're pulling the alarms, setting off, all the fire alarms, desperately trying to remain relevant. This blog was very much a update on what they're doing. And an update on a game that likely they just don't have that much to show yet, as much as we would like for that not to be true. So the bulk of this blog was basically saying we're heads down on Mass Effect. That's what we're focused on. That's the only project we're working on, which has been a departure from how BioWare has existed its entire existence. They've always been working on multiple things at once, right? So, that's notable. And straight up in the article, he says, hey, we know you want to see more. We know you want to see things. We just don't have things to show. But when we do, we'll be excited to show them. For someone like me, for anyone else who's a content creator, a community member who's excited about the game, that's disappointing. You also get it. They haven't even announced whether or not this game's in full production, which until they do, I will assume it's not, right? We haven't seen some huge hiring influx. We haven't seen a bunch of people at BioWare or who, were at BioWare, got shipped off to other studios. We haven't seen a bunch of them being like, hey, I'm back at BioWare. And I'm expecting to see them either hire a lot or see a bunch of those people return and likely make it public that they've returned before I'm willing to say like, oh, production is impending. It's kind of hard to not wonder how they've been in pre-production since like 2019, even though they took a break to ship Veilguard, in the last 2 years. It's hard to believe that they still are in pre-production, but it very well it may mean that a lot of that early pre-production really was, as they said in some of the old blogs, prototyping and just testing things out. One thing to consider is they likely spent 1 to 2 years straight up just trying to figure out workflows and stuff like that for Unreal Engine 5. If they're going to make that switch, which the most recent hiring listings that they had up suggest that they are still doing Unreal Engine 5. It seems just likely that it's just taking a long time for them to figure out how they're going to do what they're going to do, right? So that reassurance that that's what they're working on and that they're diligently working on it, that was cool. He also did talk a bit about the TV show. This was probably the more notable news, more than anything, to be honest, where he talked about the Amazon show that they're working on, where Gamble is like an executive producer or something. It's the same as if you look back at like the Fallout show, they have Tom Howard. Howard. What's his first name? I'll remember when Todd. That's it. He's listed on there as well, and same with Druckmann with The Last of Us. So in whatever role they actually have Gamble in there, he's very likely, probably mostly there just to make sure whatever they do kind of sticks to the the vision of Mass Effect. And after this blog, it seems like, and this is what he said in there, it seems like the TV show is in some capacity supposed to lead into the next game. So the main detail we got is that the Amazon show will take place after Mass Effect 3. It will not be a retelling of the original trilogy or of Mass Effect 1, like had been assumed from some of the casting calls and stuff that we had seen, and even a summary of the show, even though those are supposedly like notoriously not reliable. And so this is going to be an original story with original characters, at least in some capacity. It'll be new lore for the game, and it's going to be the first time we've gotten anything between Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda. And Andromeda literally takes place in a different galaxy. So, there's a pretty big gap there. There's a 600-year gap, and that gets into a whole different conversation. But so multiple things. It's exciting that this isn't going to try to retell Shepard's story. Gamble in the blog specifically said, Shepard's story is your story, and we don't want to mess with that. I think that's an interesting statement because I think it's more than just about the show. There's this big conversation, and we'll get more into it later. But there's all this conversation of what are they going to do with the endings of Mass Effect 3? Are they going to pick one as a canon? Are they going to try to ignore them? Are they going to try to figure out some way to make them all potentially happen and then move on from that? I find that hard to believe. I think combining all organics and synthetics, destroying all Reapers, or taking control of the Reapers are such distinct endings that it'd be impossible to make them, to try to just hand wave it and be like, yeah, one of them happened and we're moving on. But we'll see. What I think is also interesting is that the implication, or at least the way I read this, is that the events of the show may take place, right after Mass Effect 3. Well, if the show is supposed to lead to the next Mass Effect, it seems likely that the next Mass Effect, as many people have, speculated, is not going to take place 500, 600, 700 years later, over 1,000 years later, as some people have been, trying to throw out there. I'll get more into that conversation at the end of the podcast, where I talk about what I think everything we've learned so far means for the future story. But regardless, I read this as the show is going to lead into the game, and the show takes place right after Mass Effect 3, and we'll go from there. Then, that was kind of the bulk of the blog. He ends it by saying, there's definitely nothing to discover in here. So obviously there is, and taking lessons from the 2023 N7 day, there were a few letters in the blog that, depending on if you're looking, which blog you were looking at, they were either italicized or bolded. And if long story short, people figured out that it led you to a website that showed a piece of art for the next game. And what it was essentially some I assume concept art or something of a whole army of Krogan, facing you, and one without a helmet, like kind of doing like standing up cheering or whatever. And all around them are all these Krogan with like helmets and armor that doesn't necessarily seem like it's from the trilogy. Almost seems older than that. I've seen a lot of speculation about this already. I've even seen people being I guess the right word is creative enough to be like, well, the Krogan has a light on his chest, and there's a light in one of the trailers, and that means this. It's like, well, it doesn't mean anything at this point. We're still trying to figure these things out. What I would say is, I've seen a lot of people trying to say that this armor means that this is way in the future, or it's like in the past or whatever. What I've speculated so far is that the Krogan having like helmets and breather masks, but not having like sealed helmets, like spacesuits, just means that this is what like a Krogan like land military would look like. They aren't going to space, they aren't fighting in a vacuum. They're just fighting on a planet. Whether it's theirs or another one, we'll have to wait and see. And the whole implication of this picture is it's labeled Civil War. And the whole idea is that, that this is a depiction of a civil war or some kind of battle happening between Krogan. Now, if you've paid attention to the lore and to the history of Mass Effect, the idea of Krogan fighting is not all that crazy. The idea of Krogan having a civil war isn't crazy in the least bit. In fact, it seems almost a certainty no matter what is going on, right? I'll talk more about some of those implications, but it's worth keeping that in mind. In this picture, there's also, I believe, 2 of the Krogan tanks, the wheeled vehicles with the big turrets on them, and there's even on the left side a Varen, so like the dog-like creatures that the Krogan kind of use as like attack dogs. And it's interesting because the kind of main Krogan in the middle of the picture is using a pistol that is in the trilogy. All of the grunts, all of the random, soldiers around also have weapons that look like they're from the trilogy. The big difference being is that in the middle, on the top of them, they all have these like kind of glowing areas. And I've seen some people speculate like, oh, this means that there's going to be a new power source for the weapons and all this stuff. I've taken it back a little bit more than that. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think these are the weapons that we've seen before. My guess is that if you remember in Mass Effect 2 and 3, when you have the special ammo equipped, it literally would have a hologram of the ammo above the gun, and you could see it. My guess is just that modern game design isn't going to be friendly to that, because in a realistic situation, that's very much a gamified thing, right? Like in a real world situation, you don't want a glowing hologram off of your gun, right? So my guess is that this is just kind of their way of maybe introducing that there will be like ammo selection and things like that in the next game, but instead it's going to be represented by like a glowing part of the gun and maybe not necessarily a hologram coming off the gun. But I've seen people taking that different ways. Obviously, we're all just guessing. We're all just speculating at this point. I just caution people to maybe not turn speculation into like, I'm right, because we don't know yet. And I try to do that as well. So, the armor thing, I'm not as worried about it or not worried, but not as certain that we can make, big moves on that. We've even seen in like that 2020, the picture, it's in the middle of the poster of the bar scene, like there's Krogan in there, I believe, who are just wearing like normal armor, and like Volus and, most of the creatures in there seem to be wearing what we're used to. This is the first time we've even seen, a big departure from that. Even in Andromeda, the Krogan are wearing, relatively expected attire. So again, I think one of the interesting things about this poster, or whatever you want to call it, was just that it kind of looks like Krogan, we see them in like a war situation where, through the trilogy, we rarely ever see large groups of Krogan. It's normally just a few. They're normally mercs. They're normally got, pretty specialized armor. In regular war, not every single warrior gets the top tier of everything. So in this, we might be seeing a good example of one warrior with like maybe, higher end equipment or whatever, and, a leader of some kind. And then a bunch of the, without, not trying to be ironic, but a bunch of grunts wearing like more regular stuff. And I think that should be, kind of expected. And I think that's kind of the majority of what we got out of the blog. It was fairly minimal. This wasn't the big blowout of concept art and trailers and all that stuff we were hoping to find. In fact, I was, kind of disappointed, especially before people figured out the Krogan Civil War picture thing. Because, from the beginning, you could tell like, oh, there's italicized letters, like there's going to be something extra. Even then, I was still kind of hoping it was going to be a trailer or something, and it wasn't. But that's fine. It kind of is what it is. I'm you know, and if you've paid attention to my content long enough, you will know that I am very much any news is good news kind of person at this point, and that I believe, you know, that this is, you know, not a bad thing, even if, you know, we could always hope for more, but people really should go into these things kind of expecting nothing and being happy with what we get. And some people don't think that's acceptable. You know, some people expect more, they want more, and that's fine too. I just think you're setting yourself up for disappointment, just in general, maybe like just in life, you know. Maybe that's a little rude on my part or something. I'm not really sure, but I thought this blog was fine, even if I wish we got more out of it. Now, the second thing I want to talk about here is Mike Gamble's kind of tweets and stuff around N7 Day in general. So the first one he pushed back on was he posted the blog, and then, you know, people, you know, it's just a blog with a bunch of text, and this was before people found the Civil War picture. And you know, he clapped back at people, you know, pretty directly, being like, hey, I know you guys want stuff. I'm a fan too. I just don't have stuff right now. You know, like, I'm sure, I think what confuses me is that it seems like they surely have concept art they could show us, maybe even some light, like vertical slices of things that they've worked on and prototyped or whatever. But then they also have to be careful with that stuff, and that they don't want to show us stuff that maybe some things aren't final, and they don't want to show us stuff that maybe gets cut. And even though I'm okay with stuff like that, because I understand how game development works, at least in some capacity, I can handle, you know, the idea of you know, them showing us something cool that never comes to fruition. But not everyone's like that, and maybe they're probably being extra careful with messaging right now. But his pushback on people, I think, was pretty fair, and just being like, and he didn't say this, but the truth is, they don't owe anyone anything. And 7 Days started off as a fan celebration, and then BioWare kind of co-opted it, and they did a bunch of stuff. They did a bunch of collaborations. They did some new merch. They did, you know, a blog. They did give us a little teaser thing as well. Like, it's not ideal. It's not everything that we wanted, but at the end of the day, they aren't there, you know, for people like me who make content and videos about Mass Effect. They aren't there to give me content to talk about for the next year. They're just doing their thing and what they're allowed to do and what they think is smart for their franchise. When people did figure out the Civil War picture, people were asking him some questions about it, and they asked, like, is this in the future or is this in the past? Or because there was the possibility this was a depiction of one of the old Krogan Civil Wars, because they've been fighting forever, right? And Mike Gamble confirmed that this is future. This is presumably post Mass Effect 3. I think that's interesting because I saw people instantly going to like, oh, this means the genophage being cured is canon, and, you know, this and that and the other. That's probably true to a point. One thing I think people forget is that, like, in the trilogy, if Rex dies in the first game, and Reeve is the leader in 3, you can save Morden. And if you do that, he said, and that requires, so you can save Morden by messing up the genophage cure. But what he even either says in that moment or later, Morden even says, like, I'll cure it. Like, I'm going to cure it either way. Like, I'm going to do it eventually. And I believe that even if Morden dies and you cure the genophage, let's see here, if Morden dies, but you don't cure it, like if you shoot Morden, I believe there's even implication in some of the endings that his assistant, and I can't remember, his Malin or whatever, is going to cure it themselves at some point. So one thing I think is worth considering is that I'm under the impression that no matter what choices you make in the trilogy, the genophage is likely to be cured one way or the other by somebody, even if it doesn't happen during the events of the game. And, you know, the Dalatras's worries in Mass Effect 3, when you're going through this process of the Krogan becoming violent and becoming a danger and stuff like that, I've always thought that was a fair concern. I didn't really love their tact about it, right? But I think the biggest thing for me, and I'm making a video about how I think all these things are connected at this point. But the short version of it is I could easily see there be a plot line, whether it could be a main plot potentially, or a side one in the next game, where the genophage has been cured, the Krogan population is growing insanely. If you ever look at the number of children they can have and how quickly they can do it, the idea of civil war or conflict between Krogan seems assumed, especially if the genophage is cured. The part of it I don't think people are considering as much is that in almost all civil wars, or all wars in general, especially in the modern day, there's always outside influencers. And so you could absolutely convince me that there's going to be a situation in the next game where there are like 2 or more Krogan groups having a war with each other over control of Tachanka or whatever, or maybe of like their nuclear warheads or their weapons or whatever, religious areas, who knows, right? You could convince me completely that there's going to be a plot line where like the Citadel is backing one group, the Terminus, the Terminus groups are backing another one, the Merc groups or whatever, and then maybe someone else is backing another one. There's, I have all these crazy speculations and thoughts about like, what if after Mass Effect 3, the remnants of Cerberus basically scurry off and start up corporations and run them as like shadow organizations where they look just like a corporation, but in the background, they're still trying to push the elusive man's goals and stuff like that. Even they could be funding a Krogan civil war and things like that. So I definitely think we could see a situation, and I would argue it's almost guaranteed at this point, we're going to see conflict between the genophage cured Krogan that will show that there's people in the background kind of, doing the puppeteering act of putting them off against each other to see who gets the resources of Tachanka or who gets the Krogan, to use them as their personal army or something. I think that's a very likely thing that will come from this. And it's cool and it's fun to speculate about, because it very well could be the main plot of the game, where, that we've had these conversations about the N7 agent and stuff like that. Well, maybe your job is to infiltrate different groups and try to figure out who is influencing these Krogans, who has, kicked off this civil war between them, and to try to work through those problems. I think there's a mistake for the next game where people automatically think like, oh, there's going to have to be a replacement antagonist for the Reapers, this big, overwhelming, scary, bad guy, where I would argue there's a really good chance that the next show and even the next game may deal with more like pedestrian issues. And maybe there's like an overtone or an undertone of like, oh, there may be something bigger going on here, but at least for the show and likely the next game, there may just be like insinuations that there's a bigger thing happening, and we'll be dealing with relatively, pedestrian issues, political, juggling and trying to fill power vacuums after the events of the Reaper War and things like that. I'll get into that into a whole different video, but I think this is cool. This idea of this civil war is probably more complicated than people think it is right now. And the last thing that Gamble tweeted out was that all of the N7 Day teasers all fit together. So at least in my opinion, he's insinuating that all of the N7 Day teasers so far are still relevant and still matter, and that they are all in the same whatever. So you're going back to that 2020 trailer. You're going to the 2021 relay where Liara's talking to like a voice of someone that we can't hear very well. We're going back to that poster with the Geth looking crater and a ship and 4 figures walking up towards it with a bunch of little hidden things in there. And you're going to that 2023 trailer with this agent looking N7 soldier being mysterious and us seeing them for 15 seconds, right? Again, I'm doing a whole video on that and how I think all that stuff goes together and what it may tell us about the future, the plot of the next game and things like that. So we won't get into that here, but I still think it is relevant. On some of the minor notes here, we have the job listings. There's been a couple up for a few months before in 7-Day. It was a principal level designer job, which I believe reported directly in Mike Gamble, so it's a pretty high level job, as well as a lead level designer. The principal designer was taken down a day or two before in 7-Day. The lead level designer was taken down on in 7-Day or the day after. I'm not positive. Either way, they're both gone, presumably filled. I've seen some speculation from people thinking that maybe they're cutting off all hiring until after the acquisition, that's supposed to happen next year happens or not. I don't know. I doubt that. I looked at the EA website and they have 600 plus listings throughout the company right now. So I can't imagine BioWare would get singled out to not be able to hire. And I especially would be surprised if they would cut them off from hiring right now, when presumably all things are go towards beginning full production on this game sooner than later, if not already. So who knows? I have no idea. I tried to peek around a little bit and see if I could find anyone who was like, hey, I'm the new principal level designer or whatever. I haven't found anything yet. So who knows? It is one of those things that, that's movement. And I've been a pretty big talker about BioWare and their state after, the Veilguard and after Andromeda and Anthem, and how they've had kind of a turbulent decade, basically. That movement is something, and anything is better than nothing when it comes to BioWare. If they're making moves, if they're filling jobs, if they're posting jobs, if they're posting blogs, if they're if they're doing things that aren't Gary McKay announcing layoffs, I argue it's good news. Even if it may not always seem like it. I genuinely believe it is. I really have, I guess, there's a lot of pessimism, and I get it, and I get why people feel that way. I don't blame people for being pessimistic and concerned about how these things are going to work out. For me, life is short. You get one shot. If you find things that you love and that you enjoy, you should go into them, because not everyone does. And, for me, like gaming, especially Mass Effect, making videos, doing the speculation, doing all this stuff that I'm doing right now is like my fun. It's one of the things I enjoy. And it's so easy to be negative, and honestly, it's lucrative in this industry and in the thing I'm doing. If this channel, if my content was all about me just being like, BioWare's doomed, EA is evil, Mass Effect is going to get canceled, like I could do those videos and I would probably get 10 times the engagement. It would be much easier. Or I could just make stuff up and claim that I know things I don't really know. Or, I could read off some script and make, these like super high production videos where I spend 40 hours on a video that's going to get 500 views. That's not my style. If you've been around long enough, you understand that at this point. For me, it's just turned into a thing where I understand bad things could happen here, whether it's these job listings or whatever. Whether it's BioWare goes under, they get taken over by this awful group that's trying to acquire EA. I know all that stuff can be bad. I know it can go bad. I know there's a chance the next Mass Effect game never comes out. I won't dwell on that. I have real concerns in my life. I have a family, I have a job, I have my own health and my own life that I think about and worry about and all that stuff. I refuse to allow, this content creation thing, Mass Effect, video games in general, to be a negative influence on my day-to-day life. I have plenty of those if I want them, or even if I don't want them, actually. So if you ever feel like I'm being overly optimistic, if you think I push back on people too much, that's fair. You're entitled to your opinion. Just understand that, me, having this whole rant simply on a segment about job listings, it's because, one, I think that we should focus on things that we know and to have educated speculation off of that when it comes to this stuff. And two, there's a lot of people out there just trying to get your attention and just trying to get your clicks. And a lot of them have figured out that negativity and dishonesty is a good way to do that. And I hope that I never go down that path. And if I do, I hope you call me out for it. Hopefully we get more job listings that indicate full production's happening on Mass Effect next soon. And that is where we will wrap this episode up. A shorter episode, honestly, I think I'm going to save a lot of my thoughts for doing a whole separate video about how I think all of the N7-day announcements and teases all kind of work together. I normally I would do that here. I feel like that'd be better with visual elements. So that's what I'm going to do. So be on the lookout for that. my guess is that we are going to get more information in between in 7 days from here on out. I would be amazed if we get no blogs or no updates between now and next in 7 day in 2026. I suspect that we'll start getting at least some updates. If you look back at what they did with Veilguard, they announced full production, and then they did more consistent updates and didn't just rely on Dragon Age Day or whatever. So thank you for listening to this episode. Thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and or Twitch subscribers. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, please check out the links in the show description. If you have questions or feedback, hit me up on social media at Bondiesel or at Mass Effect HYPEcast. Join my Discord via the Linktree link in the episode description, or comment on Spotify or YouTube. If you comment on my episodes, either on Spotify or YouTube, I reply to basically everything. So if you have a question, you have some thoughts, you want to pick my brain, please do it, even on Spotify. It's weird. I don't know why they have comments on there, but they do. So be the first. I don't think anyone's ever commented on a Mass Effect one yet. That is all I have for this episode of the Mass Effect HYPEcast. So until next time.